on behalf of the Danube Institute, may I welcome you to this event. We've been very lucky over the years in having recruited a number of distinguished intellectuals from Hungary, from other Central European countries, from Western Europe and from the United States, and indeed as far afield as Australia. Initially, we exhibited their talents principally in major conferences, but of course we also developed a culture of debate and argument within the Institute among both the senior fellows, the visiting fellows, and also the younger research fellows whom we have working here in the building. Now, we're sorry to be losing one of our most distinguished colleagues in beginning of August. I was happy to tell you that he has accepted a position. First of all, it's David Dusenbury. David, we've been very lucky to have here. He's worked on two major books while he's been here, one which was published about the time he arrived. The first of those was The Innocence of Pontius Pilate, and the second, which has been the result of work here, was The Politics of Jesus, I Judge No One. Those books were published by Oxford University Press, and they have been, I would say, respectfully reviewed on both sides of the Atlantic. We've been very fortunate, David, in having you. We're sorry to see you go, but we anticipate that we will manage to keep you at the end of a relatively short leash, because we are hoping you will remain attached to us as a visiting fellow from abroad. Now, as I mentioned, we've tried, as a result of having such talented and interesting people here, we have developed a culture of intellectual debate within the building, and in a sense, that's what you're going to get this evening. The title doesn't entirely convey the extent and character of the occasion. China and the West, Resources of the Past, does indeed seem an interesting title, but it's also about the work of the French philosopher François Jullien, who has developed the idea of intellectual resources very seriously, and who is the author of two books, which I will hold up here: The Resources of Christianity and On the Universal, the Uniform, the Common, and the Dialogue Between Cultures. In a way, this is, in addition to the topic of China, this is about his work and the way in which the cultures of China and of the West challenge, interpenetrate each other, and in general help us to understand the likely relationships that is going to develop between the two. David will begin by discussing Jullien's work and principally about the West, and secondly, our visiting fellow, Eric Hendricks, who's been here now with us for more than a year. He will talk from his experience of China on that same topic. So I'm going to begin. They both will speak for about 20 minutes. We will then have a dialogue between them, and then I'm going to throw it open to the floor. So, first of all, David, if you would like to take the floor.
Well, thank you so much, John. And it's, in a sense, it's hard to hear that introduction. I'm sorry to be going as well. And I want to take just a moment to express my truly, immense, heartfelt gratitude, especially to the Danube Institute, to the Batyani Leoš Foundation, but especially to John and Melissa, who have been so exceptionally gracious and generous and supportive and inspiring for my 3 years here at the Danube Institute. And as John kindly said, I very much hope to maintain my ties after I leave at the end of the summer. So this is, I hope, not my last Danube Institute lecture, but as John has said, it's my last lecture in my current role at the Danube Institute. And so I would like to hark back to my very first lecture at the Danube Institute on the Czech dissident philosopher Jan Patočka, who at the very end of his life and at the very end of a set of Samizdat underground lectures he held, wonderful lectures which have been published by Stanford University Press under the title of Plato and Europe, he talks about how the conception of history that we more or less take for granted, and we're going to be exploring a bit more in the coming minutes, can by no means be presumed to be universal. So we tend to think that history is rather self-evident, self-explanatory, and shared by all cultures, all civilizations, and in all times. But what Jan Patočka points out and explores with great depth and subtlety in Plato and Europe is that what we call rather unreflectively history and global history actually owes a great deal to specific traditions, which he and we are committed to upholding, broadly speaking the Platonic tradition and broadly speaking the Christian tradition. And so what Patočka points out here is that when we speak of history, we tend to actually speak of a distinctly European conception of history in which there is antiquity, Middle Ages, and modernity. And he also points out at the bottom of the screen that there is a certain violence to Europeans simply imposing these constructions on civilizations and cultures which have their own indigenous understandings of time and history. And by the way, Patočka is very much a supporter of this construction broadly construed, as am I. But it I think, behooves us to remember that when we're discussing, as we will be discussing in just a couple of moments, the idea of history structured by ruptures, structured by major changes before Christ, after Christ. This is history structured in a very definite way. And the word itself, modernity, as I pointed out in a couple of books that John kindly mentioned, the word itself, modernity, was created by Christians in late antiquity to describe a sort of concept that no one else seemed to have, modernity. And of course, we all here at the Danube Institute appreciate that there can be a certain violence in the experience of modernity, and the experience of such ruptures is by no means uncontested. But mainly we're going to be looking at our man, François Jullien, on whom more in just a moment. Jullien very much believes that there is a distinct drama of European thought. He thinks that this drama of European thought has something to do with what he calls the universal. My colleague Eric Hendricks is going to be talking more about that, but I'll sort of comment on the universal at a couple of points. And he furthermore believes that the European drama of thought, which is shaped by the concept of the universal, is very profoundly, decisively structured by the emergence of Christianity, the rise of Christianity, and that Christianity as such marks a sort of threshold in that history, which, as we just saw with Jan Patočka, that history, that specific civilizational history, is what we generally mean when we talk about history unreflectively. So we're going to be hearing more about all the terms we see on the screen here. But just note that for François Jullien, Christian history is structured by an event. An event is a singular affair, a singular circumstance, a singular set of occurrences, sequence of occurrences. And this event is held to have universal significance. That in and of itself is a rather strange conception. We see on the bottom of the screen that, at least according to Jullien, the only reason Europeans think of history this way, that a particular event has universal significance, is because for many centuries Europeans believed that God, the creator of all, took flesh and lived among us at a particular point and place in time. So we'll also just note that the incarnation for Jullien is an inscription at the heart of the singular of a universal love. And love is going to be where we conclude in about 20 minutes. But love is a very significant concept for Jullien. He believes it is one of the most, if not the most significant resources of Christianity. First, though, let's just see a little bit about the man of whom I speak. François Jullien is indeed a very eminent sinologist, so a scholar of China. And he's not, to my knowledge, a Christian. He doesn't identify himself as such in his writings. He may, I suppose, in some sense, he may be baptized. He's a good French intellectual. But his interest in Christianity is primarily that of a scholar of culture, and he is primarily not a scholar of European culture, but a scholar of Chinese culture. And this is going to be interesting because I am going to introduce to you a few things he says about China and Chinese thought and culture. And some of them might seem a bit reductive, a bit startling, but it's important for us to know that however much his points may need nuancing, Jullien is very highly regarded as a specialist in Chinese thought and culture, and he's devoted his life to it. So nothing he says about the history of China is in any way tainted by either what he would call ethnocentrism or certainly by any sort of predisposition against the great nation of China. So first, before we come back to Christianity, let's see what this eminent sinologist has to say about China and the structure, meaning of history, the idea of an event structuring history, dividing history into two distinct but related parts, which we've already heard about. I find this a really extraordinary passage. We begin with the question, can there be a break between a before and after? This is an extremely simple question, and it would seem to most of us that the immediate and necessary answer is yes. But Jullien believes that, in fact, most archaic societies would answer no. There cannot be a break between a before and after. And it is precisely this idea of a break in history, which Jullien says here, is responsible for the fact that Buddhism had a somewhat more successful history in China than Christianity has, although Christianity has a long and very complex and very rich history in China, and indeed in other parts of Asia. And if you're interested in some of that, I would recommend the book on the screen, which is quite recent and quite excellent. But nevertheless, what we're talking about here, the universal, the event, which is the coming of Jesus, or rather the perception that the life and death of Jesus represent a coming of God to earth, and the division of history into before and after, what Jullien is arguing is that this conception of history as such was so rebarbative, was so offensive to Chinese sensibilities that might have something to do with the fact that at various different critical junctures in the history of China, when Christianity was represented at the imperial court in late antiquity and then in early modernity, the empire did not convert, as of course, well, a few other empires in history did, as we all know. All right, so very quickly, I know this looks like a lot, but very quickly I want to introduce you to a number of resources of Christianity. And even if you just leave this evening with one or two thoughts in mind, I hope that will justify the time this takes. And I just want to introduce these 7 resources which Jullien claims to find in Christianity. First, by discussing why he thinks we need to look at Christianity now, and second, by saying just a word about why he thinks, and I think, that these resources of Christianity are not only resources for the West, they are also resources for China, at least potentially. So, Jullien begins in a place where I think many of us would find ourselves quite at home. He basically says that Europeans owe immense debts to the history of Christianity, and they are quite reticent to recognize these debts or to reflect upon them. And so he begins by basically arguing that there is a systematic evasion of what he calls the question of Christianity in contemporary thought. But he says that without ceasing to evade this question, in other words, without facing this question. But when everyone is evading a question and you face it, you have to make a decision to cease to evade it. Without ceasing to evade this question, Europeans cannot understand themselves, and Europe cannot understand what has been contributed to, transformed by, discovered by, or covered up in thought by this immense legacy of Christianity, which dates back to, of course, what does the legacy of Christianity date back to? It dates back to the life and death of a man who gives us the date on which we meet in the year of grace, or the year of our Lord, or however you want to call it, the year of the incarnation, according to certain old reckonings, 2024. I'm not sure we could really call it a year of grace. That sounds a bit like a stretch, but anyway, certainly the year of the incarnation. Okay, in what possible way could Christianity be a resource not only for the West, but for China? And by the way, here I am not in any way referring to the Christians of China, who are numerous, nor am I referring to missionary efforts in China. This has no religious element per se. I'm discussing how Christianity might, as an intellectual tradition, be an intellectual resource for China at this point in time. And what we see here is Jullien, a consummate sinologist, but also a very impressive historian of European philosophy, arguing that the philosophy of Hegel, I've given you two quotes, which I realize are a bit dense, but the first quote really says it all. It appears in a passage in which Jullien is commenting on the first verses of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. And François Jullien, after he discusses this text, which we're going to discuss more in just a moment, says, from this comes all of Hegel. Now, we could have an entire lecture course on why I think this is correct, but the point I'm making here is just this, that although China never converted or has not converted to Christianity, China was and is profoundly shaped by a European system of thought, namely Marxism-Leninism. And this is another very complex history to discuss. But Marxism-Leninism, whatever else could be said, is unthinkable without the philosophy of Hegel. And the philosophy of Hegel is here is described as a Christian philosophy. So whatever deformations, in my view, profound deformations of the Hegelian tradition are introduced by Marx, nevertheless, within the Marxist tradition, within the immediate Marxist tradition, there is a compelling need to revisit Hegel, I would argue. I would argue that there's also a compelling need for those such as ourselves to revisit Hegel. Roger Scruton, I believe, was a very able and diligent reader of Hegel. But anyway, so I think the Hegelian filiation of Marxism-Leninism provides one argument among many why China, for non-religious reasons, might indeed need to dwell with some of the religious resources, or the Christian resources, rather, that we're discussing now. So if Europe cannot understand itself without Christianity, what I'm arguing here, perhaps provocatively, is that by way of Hegel, China cannot understand itself without revisiting the question of the influence of Christianity on intellectual thought. I've been having this problem recently where slides I send on to places I'm speaking seem to skip. So I think the first resource is in there somewhere, but it's not showing up for some reason. fourth is there. That's good to know. Second resource. Okay, we might have to do without the slide. Yeah, well, yes, I do indeed. It's page 36. Well, no, actually, so the first resource, which Jullien offers us, is simply the idea of an event. And here, even though we don't have the slide in front of us, we can just remember that we've already seen him ask the question, can there be a break between a before and an after? And for reasons we won't get into, Jullien, all of the comments I'm about to make, very briefly, all the comments I'm about to make about resources of Christianity are focused on the Gospel of John. So we can discuss why he focuses on John, but we're talking about John. And one of the things Jullien points out is that in the Greek, there is a particular word which is used repeatedly in the first verses of John, which he translates as advene. It came to be. It advened that God became flesh. It advened that John the Baptist began to preach and bear witness to him. And so there's this kind of structure that Jullien points out, all of which points, in his mind, to the radical, revolutionary claim that there can indeed be a break between a before and after. There can indeed be an advent, an event. So archaic societies, including China, would tend not to see history as being structured by a singular event. We see, for instance, that I lived for a couple of years in Israel, and the world, the calendar is Anno Mundi, so year of the world, year of creation. It's not structured by a break, it's structured by a beginning, which reaches down to the present day. But according to Jullien, from the very beginning of the Gospel of John, the Gospel writer is saying, yes, there can be a break between beginning and end, because something happened which divides history into two profoundly different phases. So the second resource is life as Advent. So this is, I admit, this is rather difficult. So, but Jullien believes that we see structured in the individual life this great, in the Gospel of John, this greater distinction between a before and an after, which introduces the gospel. So all of human history is structured by a before and an after because, according to the gospel writer, God advenes in the flesh and dwells among us. And then Jullien points out that throughout the gospel, there is another distinction drawn. I'm not going to focus too much on the Greek, but it's between psyche and zoe. And these are two terms which are translated in English as life. They're both life, and this confuses a lot of matters. But what intrigues Jullien is the fact that there are actually two types of life at work in the Gospel of John, and that every human life is at least potentially structured by a before and an after, which reflects and mirrors the before and after of the incarnation at the beginning of the gospel. So it is, of course, to keep this hopefully simple, it is precisely in the Gospel of John, it is in none of the other Gospels, that Jesus says you must be born again. And of course, this is a rather strange concept, which is why Jesus' interlocutor, one of the rulers of Israel and teachers of Israel, says, "What are you talking about? This is absurd. I don't understand." And Nicodemus did not understand because it was not a concept which was by any means self-evident. So the idea that life itself, that there are two forms of life, one of which is kind of purely vital, limited, conditioned. Jesus speaks to a Samaritan woman in a very interesting scene which Jullien exegetes with great skill. And Jesus is asking for water. And he says there are two types of water. There's one type of water which you will need again, and I'll drink some of that now. This is the life of suke, the limited life, the conditioned life, the repetitive life. And Jesus says there's another life, there's another water, zoe, which is spiritual, limitless, and unconditioned. And Jullien thinks that this idea of unconditioned life, of superabundant life, is intellectually interesting regardless of what one makes of Christianity as a religion. So we are really losing every other slide for some reason. So the third resource is what Jullien calls de-coincidence. De-coincidence. And I realize that this is rather arcane, but this is why Jullien says that all of Hegel comes from the first chapter of the Gospel according to John. Now, I realize that this is not a Hegel conference, and some of you might not have been reading your Hegel recently, and that's perfectly fine. But the one thing perhaps many of us will have heard about the great, I would say, Christian philosopher Hegel, is that history is structured dialectically by means of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? And broadly speaking, this is Hegel's solution of an ontological a problem regarding the essence of that which is, that which gives rise to all things, and namely, being, as the Greeks call it, cannot pass away, because if it passes away, it cannot be that which gives rise to all things. But nevertheless, that which cannot pass away is also reasonably conceived as not passing or changing in any way. And so if that which gives rise to all beings, and only something which is not passing away is capable of giving rise to all beings, does not itself change, then we have a problem. We have no possibility of creation. We have no possibility of change, of movement, of what Hegel would call becoming. So being and becoming seem to stand opposed to one another. And Hegel develops his structure of history, the thesis and the antithesis, based on the fact that becoming emerges from some sort of difference within the original zone or scope or ambit of being. I know this sounds rather arcane, but what is really fascinating is Jullien says this is a problem which is solved in the first verses of the Gospel of John in an intellectually and historically unique way when the Gospel writer says the Logos was God, is being, is highest being, is superlative life, which never passes, everlasting life. But he was not only God, he was with God. So becoming is inscribed in the Godhead at the very beginning of the Gospel of John, and this is what Jullien sees as giving rise to the whole of Hegel, that basically he sees the Logos being with God, both God and being with God, as really activating history, and in the sense that we are discussing. I'll only add that the Logos is both God and with God, and what binds them, as we're told repeatedly in John, is love. And so this idea that somehow history originates in and its meaning is structured by love is, I've already said, something we're going to be hearing a bit more about. The fourth resource is what Jullien calls the unheard of. And this is kind of similar, this is actually quite similar to the event. So the event is something which occurs in history, which cannot be predicted or predetermined by what has gone before in history. It is a new thing, in Latin, a novum. And similarly, Jullien asked the question, well, can anything really new be said? And Jullien sees in the Gospel of John the figure of Jesus as being someone who says new things. And in fact, he doesn't quote the verse, but I'm sure the verse that inspires him is John 7:46, where we hear someone say, "No man ever spoke like this man. And not as a Christian believer, but as an intellectual historian and a cultural theorist, Jullien believes that indeed unheard of things are said in the Gospel of John, which place some sort of demand upon us to this day. And the very possibility of the unheard of, something that breaks with the endless sifting of speech and defies all of thought's vassalage, is kind of, so we've heard about an event breaking into history in time. We've heard about two different kinds of life which structure the possibility of rebirth, renovation, endless life at the level of our own being. And here he's kind of talking about, can anything new happen in human thought and in human speech? And Jullien sees Jesus as a figure who brings something genuinely new. And unless this seemed just totally mystical or mystifying, I would like to flash on the screen this really extraordinary passage by the late lamented humanist philologist George Steiner, who died just a few years ago. At the end of a text he wrote on the scandal of revelation, Steiner was himself not, to my knowledge, a religious believer of any sort, but he's a man, as we see in the background of the photo, he was a man who devoted his life tirelessly to the reading of texts, and he had, I think, a dozen languages, including Hebrew. And at the end of this text, he basically says there are passages in the canon which, after a lifetime of studying texts as an unbeliever, he nevertheless cannot account for in any rational way, apart from what he calls the scandal of revelation. They seem to come from nowhere. And so this is further indication that when Jullien talks about unheard of things, this is not lazy rhetoric, but he actually is pointing to something perhaps genuine. Now, I realize this slide is probably going to make a few people rather nervous. Jullien is by no means a relativist. He actually is highly polemical in his discussion of what he calls lazy relativism, and I am not a relativist, and I don't think the writer of the Gospel of John was a lazy relativist. But what truth has subjectivity is more or less a quote from the Protestant 19th century Protestant philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. And without Soren Kierkegaard, there's no existentialism. And François Jullien very much stands in the line of French Christian existentialism. But what the resource that Jullien is evoking here, which one need not be a Christian to interrogate or to draw upon, is the idea which he does not see in the literary record, or at least not so clearly in the literary record prior to the Gospels, that truth is ultimately personal. It is of course Jesus in the Gospel who says, "I am the way, the truth, the life," which we see emblazoned in Latin on the lovely St. Stephen's Basilica across the river, often. This is and also the one who says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." This is not a truth which can be demonstrated. It is only a truth that individuals can believe or not believe. And it is only a truth which the gospel writer can bear witness to. John does not demonstrate in a rational or a scientific way, or even a historical way. The gospel writer does not demonstrate the divinity of Jesus. He bears witness, which is what he also says John the Baptist bears witness. This is the one. This is the event that gives meaning and structure to human history. And so Jullien thinks that there's something new that enters the history of human consciousness with Christianity, saying that the truth which is of universal significance is nevertheless a truth which can only be believed and borne witness to with the whole of our being. And I think by this time, perhaps, you will be grateful for the mystery of the disappearing slides. I don't know where these slides are going. But the last resource, this is not the last, well, yeah, the seventh resource is what I call love as the concrete universal. Now, Eric is going to be talking more about the universal, so I'll just say just very, very little about the concrete universal. But it seems to me more could be said apropos of Hegel. But getting back to the very beginning of my remarks, where I didn't really draw attention to this, but in his outline of different regimes or different epochs of universalism, Jullien sees logical universalism as being very clearly articulated by the Greeks, but logical universalism stands outside of the individual's reason, precisely because it is necessary and it is eternal. Juridical universalism, the universalism of citizenship in the Roman Empire, is external to the individual and to individuals precisely because it concerns who their identity as determined by law. And so the way Jullien sets it up, and this is leading back to love and concrete universalism, the way Jullien sets it up is that the abstract universalisms of reason and law act upon, we've already talked about subjectivity as truth, and Jullien says the abstract universalisms of reason and law bear upon and act upon humans from without, from outside. I may identify with what the law identifies me as, but nevertheless I come to learn what the law identifies me as, and it comes from outside. There's much more that could be said about the character of law, either in the New Testament or outside the New Testament, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's say that both logical universalism and juridical universalism form collectivities externally. And the problem that Jullien sets himself is how could a universal community be formed internally, not by reason, not by law. And the conclusion he reaches, he's not the first to reach it, but the conclusion he reaches is that it is only when the universal obligation is to love that universal communion could be formed on a basis which is neither purely rational nor purely legal. And this is what in scholastic theology is called the corpus mysticum. It is a body of many who belong together because from within they bear a love and a spirit which binds them to one another. And incredibly, Jullien thinks that this idea is important not only for Europeans to understand themselves, but even insofar as it stands behind the Hegelian and the Marxist tradition. He would claim that this has something to bring to China in the 21st century as well. Thank you.
That you did everything except keep to your time limit of 20 minutes. But I think we may also now find that the application of Jullien's thought to China may prove equally difficult to encompass in 20 minutes, but do what you can, Eric.
I will try, John. So I knew that slides were going to disappear today, so that's why I'm not working with slides and I'm working from the paper. François Jullien is one of the most, he's one of the truly powerful thinkers of our time, and he has a particular approach that he uses throughout his oeuvre. He tries to play different lines of thoughts, cultures, worldviews against each other, using each as resources. So he is a proponent of what you could call the dialogue of cultures. However, if people usually speak about the dialogue of culture, they mean something like look for the common denominator, which is a way of dumbing down the discourse. If you say, aren't all humans? Don't we all love peace? Shouldn't we all love each other? If you speak in such generalities and looking for the common denominator on the human scale, you remove intellectual tension. Jullien wants to do the opposite. He wants to accentuate the tension by creating as much of a divide as possible between different intellectual resources, worldviews, and cultures, between different lines of thought, and hence to be able to tap in to the intellectual power of these different resources. So he says about the divide, using the divide to create intellectual tension and playing different modes of thought against each other. He says, unlike difference, which leaves aside the other once a distinction is established. So, just saying, okay, the French culture is a bit different from German culture. Confucianism is a bit different from Platonism. No, you don't leave it at difference. No, you go to divide. A divide maintains the face of and thus the tension between what it has separated. So you just make a distinction, you separate, you keep the tension there. And you keep the tension there so that you could use these different modes of thought as a resource. Now, what is a resource? A resource is something you tap into, but just like if you're drilling for oil in the ground, you don't really know how much you're going to get out of it. So you tap into a resource without knowing the full extent of the resource. And a resource is not anyone's property. So you can be in his work on resources of Christianity, which David just discussed. He explicitly doesn't start as a believer, right? He doesn't say, as a Christian believer, I'm going to tap into my Christian roots. No, he discusses intellectual resources in Christianity that are available to anyone, whatever their intellectual tradition may be. Because just like a resource in nature, if there's an oil field, anyone can grab it potentially, right? Just that intellectual resources, multiple people can grab it at the same time. they're not depleted in the same way. So he says, a resource goes to whoever discovers it, the more deeply he discovers it, and draws benefit from it. Because it retains a measure of potential, because it counts on a future in which to deploy, a research is not something to delimit or define from the start. And because of his specialization, Professor Jullien is an expert on Chinese philosophy, while also being very knowledgeable on the ancient Greeks and the Christian tradition. So I would say that the ancient Greeks and the Chinese are his main foci. He in many of his works he writes about Western intellectual, Western philosophical history, and inserts bits of Chinese thought as resources, as creators of tension to destabilize. And he does the same in his works on Chinese philosophy. He uses comparisons with Western ideas to destabilize. He never just leaves it there where he says, okay, the Chinese say this, and Descartes said something else. He doesn't just leave it at the comparison. No, he plays ideas against each other. Hence, he takes the ideas fully seriously and he tries to tap into the resource that they offer as much as possible. So that's his general approach. On China, let me quote him on China real quick. So he says, for my part, I have been able to characterize a little more closely what constitutes Europe only by going to China, as it turned me back towards my culture. This even constitutes what I see as one of the main aspects of my work. This is to affect the emergence of the implicit and largely buried choices which have formed Europe and are assimilated by it as if they were self-evident by considering those Chinese perspectives that have been constituted alongside them. So he looks at the things that we take for granted, assumptions. They come out through the confrontation with the different bodies of cultural thought, of philosophy. And I've, on a much more amateurish level, I've also been playing this game. So I've lived in China for 6 years, and I've also been doing this, playing this game where the confrontation with assumptions in Chinese thought and the patterns of Chinese cultural life have have placed me in front of a mirror, which suddenly, which allowed me to see things about my own assumptions and cultural background that I was previously unaware of. So, François Jullien goes on a very deep philosophical level, right? But more mundanely, one of the things that I, for instance, was surprised by when I first went to Peking University in 2015, when I entered the sociology department there as a researcher, I was surprised that the sociology works very differently in China, and I even drew the conclusion in the end that actually what we call sociology in the West is implicitly embedded in Western assumptions, Western ideological motifs, and should probably be considered particularly Western and liberal, and is not culturally neutral. To give you a very concrete example, in sociology and in other social sciences and the humanities, discussion is considered very central. Discussion is, since the Greeks, discussion is considered key to philosophy, key to academic life, as the universities developed in the Middle Ages and then further into modernity. But in Chinese universities, you're really not supposed to have discussions, right? Your students can, at an elite university, ask questions theoretically, but it's not very common. And until a few years ago, students wouldn't, at any level of education in China, ask questions because it would be considered impolite. It would be seen as implying that the teacher didn't explain well. China is much too hierarchical for little postdocs, because I was a little postdoc researcher, for me to have discussions with Chinese professors. That's absolutely not how a Chinese university works. I could have discussions with other postdocs, perhaps, but you cannot just skip rank. Hierarchy is too central. There's this one way in which sociology is the way we approach sociology in a Western university is very different from the way it's approached in a Chinese university, and a much deeper levels to this. Argumentative styles, what is considered true or not, the basic epistemology that your social sciences and humanities discipline take for granted, right? You'll take it if you just in a Western context, you'll think, this is how it works. And then if you actually go outside of a Western context, that's when you learn that no, this is actually not these are not culturally neutral assumptions. Things can be very different. But it will probably be a bit too complex to go into that. But I discovered that on a very deep level, my discipline was Western. And that in Chinese context, it meant something very differently. For example, your epistemology could be based on Xi Jinping thought. Xi Jinping thought could be the epistemological embedding of your scientific theory. Well, this is a very different approach, let's say. Another thing that was interesting is that I felt so Christian. I felt so Christian in China. Usually when I speak to Christians in the West, I feel very non-Christian. I felt very Christian in China. To just give you an example, I worked for an education consultancy firm. And in China, relations are always more important than abstract truth. Or truth emerges also in the Chinese tradition from social relations. Truth is never conceived as something that you get when you abstract away from your concrete relations. This is very much the Greek approach. You're in a certain city-state, you're in Athens, you are a certain person. Okay, forget that you're a certain person, forget where you are, try to take all the specificity out of the picture, then you have the truth. It's an abstracting process. So Greek truth, and the Western tradition of thinking about truth, is very abstracting. Now, there's a little bit of a spin to that, because in Christian tradition, there's truth as conscious, so there's more to it, but at least the Greek root is very abstracting. In China, it's much more, the relations are more central. So, for example, one way this plays out, so I worked in this education consultancy firm, there are Americans working there, and they're Chinese colleagues. The Chinese manager makes a plan on Monday and says, okay, we have to do this. It's an unworkable plan, and the employees know it but don't say anything. Okay. By Tuesday, one part of the team is working on a plan B, let's say, and another part of the team is working on plan C. On Wednesday, most people are working on plan B. Okay. Now, what my Chinese colleague said is, when we talked about it later, and the Westerners mentioned, hey, the plan has changed. That's fine, but the plan has changed. They said, that my Chinese colleague said, the plan has not changed. They pretended that plan B was always plan A. And some of my colleagues, some of my American colleagues, they got very upset, and I also felt a little bit upset. I was like, okay, it's fine. I'm fine that the plan has changed, but can we now please assert the truth that first we had one plan, and now we have another plan? And my Chinese colleagues were, why? Why would you do that? Because it's a potentially creates conflict. It could be a loss of faith for the manager. It's not important what the original plan was. The only thing that's important is that you're now doing this plan, and it seems to be working. So what's your problem? So these Chinese colleagues were all thinking, like, what's your problem? And these Westerners, they were just boiling, and they were ready to die for abstract truth. Like, I'm not going forward until we've established that the plan has changed. And I felt very Christian at this point, because I was like, my Chinese colleagues were, why are you asking, why are you so adamant about this, Eric? And at some point I couldn't explain myself, and I just said, because God is watching us right now. So I could give more of these examples, but this is interesting. So if you go outside of your cultural zone, it holds up a mirror, and suddenly you find out more about yourself, and you can tap into intellectual resources that you previously didn't have access to. Now, in Jullien's book on the universal, he writes about Western traditions of universalism, and he uses China mainly as a negative. He argues that in China you may not have something worthy of the title universalism. You have the universal, but not universalism. So Jullien distinguishes universal, or the category of the universal, first from the uniform and the common. And he illustrates the uniform with global formats. You can have a uniformizing global format. Maybe use of English can be homogenizing in certain contexts, right? That's the category of the uniform. When we talk about globalization, we're often talking in the category of the uniform, not truly in the category of the universal or the common. The common, here Jullien uses the example of the political community. The politeia, this is where the Greek city-state, this is where he locates the root of systematic reflection on the common. Now, universalism is something different. Universalism in a strong sense, because it's about a normative imperative. True universalism, or universalism in a strong sense, doesn't just say, this is a universal characteristic within a category. All swans are white. There's a black one. Okay. We drop the theory. That's not what universalism is about. It has a prescriptive nature. So it says all humans should be free, or everyone is entitled to human rights. Everyone should be under the law. There should be a rules-based order. Everyone should be on the Roman law. Just making it up here. But this is truly universalizing thought, right? Now, in the West, Jullien identifies 3 layers of universalism. He starts with the universalism of the Greek logos. This is the philosophical universalism. This is the argumentative universalism. The second universalism is the universalism of the Romans, the universalism of Roman law. And the third one is the universalism of Christian love, of Christianity, of the Paulian notion of salvation. Salvation for all. And world history condensed in the event of Jesus coming on earth and God appearing in the flesh. Now he says that China doesn't have this. China doesn't have this abstracting Greek logos. It has philosophy, but it doesn't have the universalism of the logos. It doesn't have the universalism of the law. Now it gets a little bit complicated here because the Confucians were very anti-law. They thought that law was not so important, and prudence, benevolence are the key virtues. And the focus on law is superficial because in practical, concrete circumstances, we need wise people making contextualized decisions. But you have other schools of thought in China, the Moists, the legalists, that are more law-oriented. But it is true that overall, law has a much less central place in the Chinese tradition of political thought than it has in the Western tradition of political thought. And that's, of course, the heritage of the Romans that we're talking about here. China also doesn't have, traditionally at least, or if we forget about all the little Christian influences that did occur throughout Chinese history for a second, pre-Christian China didn't have a notion, didn't have this Christian universalism. For instance, one example of this is when the Jesuits went to China. We already saw in David's presentation that the notion of an event itself, as Jullien conceptualizes it, was not truly known in China, or was not fully possible according to mainstream Chinese thought. But it's also the story of Jesus didn't make sense to a lot of ordinary Chinese people when they first heard it because of the crucifixion. How could the Messiah, how could this powerful person be crucified alongside common criminals, as if he has no status in society? China has a very hierarchical society. So there's this notion of the common man being crucified and alongside common criminals didn't make any sense. And the Jesuits actually had to de-emphasize it when selling Christianity in the first generations of contact between the Christian realm and China. So Jullien then says, okay, he wants to move away from universalism, but he still wants to retain the category of universality as a regulatory idea, and the regulatory idea being shared common intelligibility between humans and between cultures. And he wants to proceed from that basis and have a dialogue of cultures. And now, interestingly, and David already mentioned Hegel, interestingly, the way François Jullien sketches universalism and proposes to overcome universalism by focusing on universality as a regulatory idea has quite some parallels with Hegel's move in Rechtsphilosophie, in the elements of the philosophy of right. Because in Hegel's elements of the philosophy of right, he has a similar timeline and a similar taxonomy and a similar move from universalism to the true universalism of universality or particularity, reaching out to other particularity and thereby manifesting the true universality. So with Hegel, you have this notion in the elements of the philosophy of right that you have the empire. So he distinguishes the four empires. The first empire just declares itself, this first stage of human history, just declares that you have an empire that just declares itself good. It's there, it's good, no thinking, no comparative thought, it's there. And Hegel probably was thinking of pharaonic Egypt, but you can also think of China before the contact with the modern West. In China, before the late 19th century, the emperor centered the universe. The Chinese court centered the universe. China was the central realm of the world. On the edges of the world, you had some barbarians; they didn't truly count, and in other kingdoms that were outside of the direct control of the emperor were legitimate insofar as they were symbolically aligned with the center by making ritualized visits to the Chinese court. So there was a notion of we are the world. That's it. No reflection on that. The second empire, it's for Hegel, is the Greek Empire, where the Greeks have the intuition, have the sense that they cannot just say that they represent the good, or that they represent the world, or that they represent the universal. They have to argue for it. There's already an extra level of reflection there. The third empire in this last paragraph of the Elements of the Philosophy of Right, is the Roman universalism, because the Romans they solve the problem that they somehow know that they're not the world, but still want to claim the world by conquering the world. So they try to conquer the world and impose Roman law, and therefore they bring universality to the world. So insofar as they're not a true universal yet, they try to become the universal by inscribing their universal Roman law upon the world. And then in the fourth empire is the Germanic Empire for Hegel. And in the Germanic Empire, the particularity of culture and nationhood and the particularity of a particular time period recognizes itself as particular among other particulars, and as such reaches the true insight of the universal. And I think François Jullien makes a somewhat similar move, and I will quote him here, where he talks about the dialogue between cultures. The result of this is, first of all, that the plurality of cultures is no longer to be considered in terms of an inventorying of differences, but of the exploration of the divergence which sets up attention, revealing the extent of the possibilities and disclosing the diversity of cultures as so many resources to exploit. This is a way to invite a move away from a sterile defense of cultural identity towards the fertility that begins with resistance to the uniformization that globalization has engendered. A dialogue of cultures will itself have force only if it brings into play this dia of the divergence and the negative, at the same time as it allows itself to be situated on this single common level of the intelligible logos. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, thank you for two very stimulating lectures. I'm now going to ask each of you a question about your lecture, and then one question to both of you. The first question is this. One of the first slides had the concept of spiritual violence in it. It was applied by, in a sense, eliminating other cultures entirely from history, because our history didn't really recognize them. They were barbarians and beyond this. But there is a very interesting example, David, of spiritual violence in a cultural in cultural politics in our time, which is the decision of the European Union not to include the history of Christianity when describing, in its own constitution, and the preamble to the constitution, which they left out not simply God. That's one could make a case for that, I think, but Christianity as the founding ideas of the civilization. Now, my question is, what do you make of that? And secondly, what do you think the Chinese have made of it and will make of it?
Oh, that is a really fascinating question. So what have we made of it, and what would the Chinese? What do I make of it, and what
do you think the Chinese make of it? What do you think the Chinese make of it? Because that's obviously we're discussing about these two civilizations trying to understand each other and having conflicts.
Okay, well, let me begin just by putting a little distance, and I'm not going to speak at great length, but I'm not sure what Jullien would say, so I'm not in any way pretending to speak for Jullien. But I do think that Patočka, whom I quoted at the beginning, I think Patočka would have been dismayed and displeased by the decision John has mentioned not to recognize the Christian legacy in the formation of the European Union, which of course ultimately is inspired by, Christian democracy. Numerous profoundly Christian thinkers were involved in the original conception and even creation of the EU. And there are really eminent, I quoted something from George Steiner. I mean, I could mention also Umberto Eco was fully in support of recognition of Christianity in the EU Constitution. So I think the greatest minds of the continent, actually, I would claim, the greatest minds of the continent were happy to see that enshrined in the Constitution. It was the uniform mediocrities who actually often fill the bureaucracies and head up the bureaucracies who took umbrage. Now, I am really not in a position to speak to the second question, how China would perceive this European embrace, let's say, this public European acceptation of the Christian legacy. But I'll make two little remarks. One is that I read an interview with, I don't want to get his name wrong, but he's the head of the Chinese delegation to the European Union in Brussels. I read an interview with him in Politico last fall, I believe, and he sang the praises of the glories of European civilization, architectural, artistic, and so on and so forth, in ways that I have not heard a European politician, certainly not a European politician coming from the EU Commission in a very long time. So I think my impression, please correct me if you disagree, Eric, but my impression is that they're agreeable to the European celebration of the European legacy. And I think as proof of that, we could point to, this is a purely sort of analytic comment, but we could point to the recent visit of the Chinese premier to Budapest and to Belgrade, both of which are, one legally and the other continentally, European polities which celebrate their Christian legacy.
Thank you. Now, you may want to chime in on that last point yourself, Eric, but before you do, let me give you your question. I was reading about the memoirs of a Western diplomat, a British diplomat in China in the Second World War. And when the news of the Japanese attack, which was, of course, initially very successful virtually everywhere, occurred, he was invited by the local government to give a speech about we were all now allies against the Japanese. And he said, well, he prepared the speech. He stood up and he said, look, things don't look too good at the moment. I see that. The Japanese have advanced everywhere. But the long-term economic fundamentals are clear, and that there is no doubt that we will turn these early defeats into victories within a couple of years, and we can look forward to victory. This produced an absolutely shaken audience. He said that there was, far from giving comfort, they were either a mixture of outraged or depressed. And then the local government Chinese spokesman stood up and said, everything's marvelous. There's nothing to worry about. The Japanese are already beginning to retreat, etc., etc. Okay. If that's a picture of the reality of the time, what does it mean, and what reliance can we place on the thought of Xi Jinping? If that's going to be the basis for epistemology.
Is my microphone on, by the way?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for that, John. It is true that in China you will often communicate in slightly less. You will think sometimes it's tempting to think that in Chinese context you will communicate in less direct ways, and that you evade painful points. It's, however, in other instances, Chinese people can be very direct. It's just when they're direct about other kinds of things. In China, it's, for instance, very normal if you meet a person who is overweight to say, "Oh, you should just," let's say you just met this person. "Oh, you're fat. You're fat. Hey, that's funny. You're fat." And also, there's a kind of rough rough, common people crudeness to expression. So if for instance, I was recently talking to a Chinese friend, and I said, I met this scholar, and I was giving a description, and she said, Eric, this man is his brain is rotten, or his brain is dead, and I was like, wow, this person has a lot of valuable insights. She said, no, Eric, this person is the rotten brain. So so whenever you think that the Chinese are indirect, they're going to surprise you with their directness. Whenever you think that they're kind of direct you, they're going to surprise you how evasive they can be. It's all about the hierarchy. So you cannot embarrass anyone who's anywhere near the top, because then heaven falls onto the earth, and everything is wrong. About the first part about Europe, it's definitely the current party line to stress the particularity of the different civilizations on Earth, including the European one, and to reject thereby universalist claims on behalf of Western ideologies such as liberalism and progressivism, but also Christianity, certain interpretations of human rights. The Chinese are really sick of Westerners telling them what is universally true or valid, and they have set up a counter polemic in which they now stress the plurality of cultures, and I think it's partly genuine, partly strategic, and in that rhetoric of multipolarity and a multi-civilizational world, Europe can be fully respected as a particular civilization. So, from a Chinese point of view, European leaders are very much encouraged to stress the Christian roots of Europe and to stress historical particularity. And please stop making these universalist claims, particularly if they end up being critical of China.
So you're saying that could be one reason why Western elites continually seek to distance themselves from the Christian roots of their civilization, and to suggest that the rules, the applications of a human rights law, for instance, have nothing to do with the civilization from which they have most strongly emerged, but are in fact universally true. So, I mean, is that why we move away from Christianity in our discussions of international law?
Yeah, I think so, and it's also very particularly ironic because Christianity is one of those universalizing strands of thought. Although there's much more to Christianity, of course, but it's one of the types of universalism that are stacked upon each other in the Western tradition. We mentioned Greek logos, the Roman law, and Christian universal love, and then finally, of course, springing from that, the universalism of the revolutionary political ideologies. Yes, we have we have these very strong universalizing tendencies in Western thought, and are not necessarily matched by what the Chinese have. Although you can argue about it, because Jullien, he will not take the universalism of ritual in the Confucian tradition as a true universalism. But you could, of course, say that that's just a different approach to universalism. So either you say the West has particular types of universalism, and a lot of them stacked on top of each other, or you say universalism is something particularly Western that not all cultures have.
Well, the late Kenneth Minogue, the Australian philosopher who was actually a mentor to late David Martin Jones, our colleague, he in effect argued that the West's rejection of its Christian heritage was just another smart move in the West's imperialism, intellectual imperialism. Now, let me raise another resource. Music is surely one of the most important resources of civilization, and the classical tradition in Western music is a very, very strong example of this, because two things seem to be true. One is that it has conquered and is conquering the world outside Europe. There doesn't seem to be any part of the world in which the classical tradition in music is not important and growing. And one of the most remarkable effects of this is the number of soloists on the piano and other instruments who come from Asia and from China. Now, my question here is, what are your reflections on the fact that that Western classical music is so successful in the rest of the world, particularly China, and secondly, the fact that it is not, at least it doesn't seem to be, maintaining its dominance in our own civilization, where I think fewer and fewer young people. We found when we were in Asia, there were huge numbers of enthusiastic young, in our case, Vietnamese, who were at a concert, and you would never get that number of people going to such a concert in our part of the world.
Yeah, you're exactly right, John. I've lived in South Korea. I've lived 6 years in China, and I've been to musical performances. And I know a Chinese classical musician who plays the guzheng, this Chinese instrument you play with the long nails and the snares. So they have their own instruments in China, which are hybrid. They're based on traditional instruments, but modernized by contact with the Western classical music tradition. And they have our Western tradition of classical music. And it's in Korea. I've seen it being very strong, and I've seen it being very strong in China. Why is this? Well, first of all, there is a long tradition in China of valuing music, also on the philosophical level. So it's in classical Confucianism, music is considered part of the ritual structure, and the ritual structure is part of the moral order of society. So having music in your society that bonds people together, from a Confucian point of view, is absolutely central to having a vivid community. However, what you had in China in the 60s is the late 60s, you had the Cultural Revolution unleashed by Mao Zedong and the Red Guards. And the Cultural Revolution attacked high culture, the notion of high culture, cultural prestige, and music. And it tried to create a new proletarian music. That's true, but the Red Guards went into people's houses and burned books. They destroyed pianos. However, China's made a major comeback from this. And the current leadership it descends from the people that were prosecuted during the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping's father was prosecuted during the Cultural Revolution. So there's kind of an immunity now to things such as the Cultural Revolution, to this excessive revolutionary egalitarianism that attacks high culture, attacks cultural elevation. And I think that in the West, we haven't been immunized sufficiently. It's one argument you could make. It's a polemical argument, perhaps it's a daring argument, but maybe there's more of a sense of cultural revolution, proletarian cultural revolution now in the West than there is in China.
Don't worry, that will happen, Eric, so look out for it. David, what your response on music?
Can I just add that the Jesuit fathers, I've been reading a bit of the memoirs of one of the most learned and inquisitive of the Chinese emperors in the late 17th century. So when Leibniz was corresponding with the Jesuit fathers in Peking, and in addition to being taught kind of optical theory and painting and so on and so forth, the emperor was actually taught the harpsichord by the Jesuit fathers. So I mean, there was actually a receptivity to, now in this particular passage I have in mind, the emperor was playing his favorite Chinese tune on the harpsichord, but nevertheless, I think there was an immediate recognition in the late 17th century that music represented one of the excellences of European culture, along with perspectival painting, modern post-Renaissance perspectival painting, and astronomy. So one of the ways in which I think it's curious, one of the ways in which the Jesuits advanced their cause in the Far East was actually winning astronomical contests, predicting eclipses, and so on and so forth. So this was a kind of demonstrable success, which then allowed them to pursue more cultural endeavors.
Good. Well, thank you. And I have one final question for the two of you, which is, before I throw it open, there's a good bit of cultural news the other day. I read that I think it's King Fahd University in Riyadh, has just established a philosophy department. And visitors in the past who mischievously asked why there was no philosophy department there were told it wasn't necessary because all truth is available in the Quran and you didn't need to have a department of seeking truth. Now it's been opened. What would be for you a similar case of our culture and Chinese culture opening up more creatively and amicably, so to speak, to China and the West, respectively? Eric?
Wow, yeah, that's quite something. It's, of course, a very important question because that's exactly the direction in which we should be thinking. I mean, geopolitics is all, and geopolitical competitiveness, it's understandable. But of course, it's a very healthy approach to also ask yourself, oh, there's a different political system, there's a different civilization, a different culture. What can we learn? That's a very healthy approach. There's a lot of things we can learn from the Chinese. And you learn them by studying Chinese history, studying Chinese culture, interacting with Chinese people. And that there's so continuous that you will immediately enter a learning process. Something big, a kind of big strategic thing we can take from them. Well, we'll see what happens in the United States. Maybe the industrial competition with China is really gonna put America on alert because America had become rather sleepy, thinking that it could just outsource all its industry. Maybe being slapped in the face by the biggest what is now the biggest industrial producer in world history by far, is sufficient to wake up Americans that they actually have to be patriotic if they want their country to be successful. So reigniting American patriotism would be good for America and for the West.
I read just today on X, I think it was a David Goldman tweet, that an AI application devised by a number of Stanford University researchers has more or less been shown to have engaged in some sort of intellectual property theft of an AI application devised at, I think, Tsinghua University. But this is one of the standard talking points, that China is simply stealing American intellectual property, and this was regarded as a kind of significant exception and reversal of that rule. But I would only add just very quickly, there's a very long tradition of both Western and I would say specifically conservative Western fascination with, of course, the Buddhist influence, which is not unique to China, but the Buddhist influence on European philosophy is very significant. Arthur Schopenhauer elaborated a really grand philosophy in the 19th century, which he argued in a certain sort of way. He was not by any means a Buddhist or a Christian by conviction or persuasion, but he argued that the Buddhist philosophy of compassion and the Christian philosophy of love converged in some significant way. But I would say that there's a really grand tradition of European fascination with the Confucian corpus and Confucian traditions. So Ezra Pound translated well or poorly is debated by specialists, but in my opinion, the greatest specialists think that Ezra Pound kind of almost preternaturally translated some of the Confucian poetry rather well. But Ezra Pound was a great lover of Confucian verse, and Simon Leys, the great Belgian, Australian conservative, translated the Analects. And And so I think I think Jullien, one of the Eric, I totally agree with Eric that in a sense the Chinese tradition is portrayed a bit negatively on the universal for reasons that he sketched. But one of the really fascinating exceptions to that is when a passage in Mencius is used as some sort of indication of the existence of something that one can only put between scare quotes, according to Jullien, one might call human nature. And Mencius talks about the fact that if one sees a child, any child, approaching a well and about to fall into a well, that one's heart would reach out and one would be moved, regardless of legal consequences or desire to be praised, regardless of whether this child belongs to someone you don't like or not. One would be moved to save this child. And so this is a Confucian, broadly speaking, Confucian element that Jullien looks to. Could I have one last thing?
Yes.
Because I was really fascinated because getting back to the question of European universalism and Chinese particularism and to speak very crudely, but Jullien points out, I think this is very useful for us to actually remember, that the French Revolution begins with two very radical declarations of the rights of man, only the rights. And it is the Declaration of the Rights of Man which presides over the Robespierrean terror. And after the death of Robespierre, they reissue the declaration, and now it's called Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man and Citizen. And I think it's actually very salutary for us every time we discuss human rights. I think it's a good discipline to discuss human rights and duties. I think that's a significant improvement. But this is what's so fascinating, is Jullien points out that suddenly there's this passage on the family in the Declaration of Rights and Duties in 1795. He's intrigued by the fact that there's no mention of the family in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which leads to the terror. The family disappears. There's the individual and the state, nothing in between. But in 1795, they bring the family back. And he says, it's very curious. They say, no one is a good man or citizen, I don't have it memorized, who is not a good father, brother, friend, spouse, and son. And Jullien, who is quite knowledgeable in French constitutional history and in the Confucian tradition, says, these five relations sound quite a bit like the Confucian five relations. And as I just pointed out with the Jesuits in China 100 years earlier, this is not actually a wild supposition. So he doesn't assert it, but I would like to point out, I've mentioned that conservatives have a long history of looking to Confucianism, but potentially even the French revolutionaries did as well.
Can I just add to this that the French Revolution very much looked towards the Enlightenment thinkers. And the Enlightenment thinkers were absolutely in love with the Confucians. So Voltaire admired the Mandarin scholar in China. So you're right to suggest that there may have actually been that the French may have actually taken it directly from the Chinese.
Well, I think it's fair to say Western civilization, Western culture, particularly the Anglo-American one, actually, is a magpie culture. Wherever it goes, it picks things up and adopts them into itself. Think of the number of English words that are, in fact, Indian words from the 18th century. Now, having said that, what about questions from the floor? Yes?
Yeah, thank you very much. So my question is addressed to all three of the panelists. I do notice something that's very funny in that as a non-Westerner, I notice that many of my cohorts who comes from all the places in the world, they have a thirst for everything Western, music, history, philosophy, etc., etc. I count myself among them. But I also notice that the Western men and women that I come across, especially in my university setting, are so quick to repudiate the same things that I have this great thirst for. For example, being Vietnamese, whenever I talk to an American, it doesn't take like 2 or 3 sentences for an American to say, "We're sorry for what we did to your country back in the 60s," something like that, right? And I find it rather funny because my generation of Vietnamese do not harbor grievances against Americans about that. So my question is, how can the Western man I guess, overcome this sort of stump of, I guess, guilt or regret, real or imagined, when and communicating with someone like me who's so curious about what you guys have to offer?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it, really? David?
Yeah, that is a huge question. I mean, in a sense, I would say that on the 11th of June, there's going to be a roundtable here at the Danube Institute discussing a new book called The Wisdom of Our Ancestors. And there is something actually rather radical about this title, The Wisdom of Our Ancestors in 2024. And I think, something as simple as the recognition that those who came before us did lamentable things. And I mean, I think it's so essential for us to realize that we, all of us, not just the West, right? All of us humans, all the great power blocks are doing lamentable things now. But they had great wisdom, which they've passed on to us, and they built gorgeous structures and so on and so forth. So I think, I mean, in a sense, a lot of this self-hatred is actually, getting back to classical music, I think a lot of this self-hatred is due to ignorance. And so strangely enough, I think just as non-Westerners are perhaps more likely than young Westerners to know the symphonies or Beethoven's late sonatas at this point, part of the reason that young Westerners might not love their legacy is because they don't know it.
Eric?
Yeah, this is quite a question, and maybe I can combine it with the final question you asked us previously, John, by answering one of the things that Westerners who perhaps have a tendency to be in a sickly and unproductive way guilty in very generic terms and uninformed terms about their legacy. Perhaps it would help them to actually go out of the Western cultural sphere of influence, go to other centers of culture and learning and dig into other intellectual traditions and other political traditions and political discourses, and see that the many others in the world are usually not doing this. So, for instance, I think if you consume some Chinese contemporary Chinese anti-Western polemics, if you just read, let's say, 10 polemical anti-Western essays published by Chinese scholars in just the last few years, you're very unlikely to feel a strong urge to be very critical towards your Western tradition, right? You get a different sense. You get like, oh, okay, if you're all kicking us, then maybe we shouldn't kick ourselves so obsessively. And I think that a lot of Westerners have underestimated just how much anti-Western polemics are out there and how hostile many intellectuals and politicians around the world are against the West. Now, if you notice this, if you see this enormous ocean of hostility towards the West, well, then you may want to rethink your obsession with generic anti-Western guilt. So that would bring you to the final question, because so you could use China therapeutically. Like it's, for instance, we have this whole. One of these guilt-ridden discourses in Western academia is a discourse, or are the discourses in post-colonial studies influenced by Edward Said's Orientalism book, in which he argued that the concept of West-East, essentialistic West-East distinctions have been set up as tools for intellectual dominations of the West over the East. If you actually go into study Eastern intellectuals, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in China, whether it's in the contemporary era or the early 20th century, you're going to find out that these West-East dualities are actually as much a product of East Asian intellectual life as they are a product of European intellectual life. And the biggest promulgator of essentialistic West-East dichotomies today is the Chinese Communist Party, which uses its enormous propaganda machine to just cover China every day again under this notion that China represents harmony and the West represents hegemony. So there's a normative inversion, but the dualism is very much, it's co-produced by Western and Eastern intellectuals with reversed normative orientations. So one way of getting out of this guilt-ridden Saidian discourse that we have in our universities is to actually go out into the world and see if it is true that these West-East dichotomies are constructed as tools of oppressing the East, or, in fact, realize that it is much more complex and that these dichotomies have different political purposes in different political settings.
Well, I would have thought that, in a sense, the Russian government is an interesting case here because, on the one hand, not just the government, but the Russian people are, culturally speaking, quite chauvinistic. They're very proud of their culture, in my view, rightly so, but very proud of it, and would be no other Western country would exceed them, not even the French, in their own pride in their cultural achievements. But at the same time, the propaganda, the agitprop departments of Russian governments, previously under the Soviets, but also under the communists, have, in their relations with the Third World, have been offering a consistent outflow of anti-Western diatribes, which basically are not accurate at all. I mean, they're in some ways, completely false, otherwise accentuating some Western crimes to the exclusion of any rational view of the West. So what you have in Russia is this odd combination of being patriotic in relation to your own culture and being completely hostile to the rest of Western culture in some of your relations. Of course, not all of them. I'm talking about the agitprop foreign policy, but still, it's interesting and important. I think what you both said have been correct, of course, but having said that, I think this question is a really difficult question to answer because so many tributaries flow into the question. One is, of course, the fact that the First World War was a terrible moral civil war throughout Western civilization, and it undermined the claims of the West with the rest of the world. The second is the Holocaust, which was not the act of the whole of Western civilization. Of course, most of the countries in the West were against the Germans when this was being carried out, and even within Germany, it was the product of an extraordinary, viciously hostile ideology which has seized control of the German people. But nonetheless, the whole of the West feels guilty about the Holocaust because they didn't stop it as well as because the Germans perpetrated it. And somehow or other, I think that's an unjust feeling, but nonetheless, it's an understandable one. And while it's there in the back of our minds, it makes a defense of ourselves against false charges difficult for many people. I don't think it's difficult for everybody. Commonsensical terms, it isn't and shouldn't be. But nonetheless, for some people, it is. And I think that partly stems from our Christian sense of taking moral responsibility for things which we have done, and in other things which we have not sufficiently prevented. David, any more questions? And I'm looking at the timekeeper lady at the top there. What? Okay, one more question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you guys. I mean, the Chinese, with a great deal of justification, have a view of Christianity as as pure poison. Manifestly in the case of the Taiping Rebellion, but in numerous other cases. And you seem to avoid the subject. So I was just, in the sense of, like the Chinese embrace Buddhism, journey to the West and all that. The Chinese have their own locally developed theologies, ideologies, ways of thinking about the world. But only Christianity has been an abject failure. The Nestorian Church vanished. The Catholic Church has been forced to make a compromise in the appointment of bishops and clerics. I mean, it would appear to me, and the entire missionary project in China, even though it was very enthusiastically embraced in the 19th century and right the way up until the end of the Chinese Civil War, really, it's been shown to, it's been an absolute failure as well. So, I mean, I'm just curious about, to the extent that that Chinese society, or at least the endorsed ideology that's supposed to govern Chinese society, is extremely suspicious of Christianity. I'm just curious about how these ideas are actually applicable. I mean, how you can actually engage with China if you're trying to use Christianity as a sort of a way of framing things.
Yeah, thank you for that question and that comment. I wouldn't argue that we need Christianity to reach out to China. And I would also agree with you that the Taiping Rebellion, which was led by a leader who considered himself, I believe, the brother of Jesus Christ, I'd agree with you that has tainted the Christian tradition. However, I disagree with the generalizing notion that Christianity in China has been an enormous failure. There's been so many good things that came from the Christian contact with the Chinese world. There's been so many positive instances of cultural exchange, and on an enormous scale. In the early 20th century, the entire education system of China, the entire general national education system was run by missionaries. Peking University, where I worked, it was built it now has a campus that's built in an imperial garden. But it was originally a missionary school. Tsinghua, it was a Christian school started by missionaries. And then they founded Peking University elsewhere in the city, and then later they moved into the campus that was set up by Christians. Tsinghua University, the other flagship university of China, started as a preparatory school for education in America, and was very much Christian inspired. So there's so much there that is positive, and that has been covered up by the communists, right? We shouldn't forget that it was the communists who covered it all up. The Kuomintang had Chinese had leaders that were Christian, that had converted to Christianity. South Korea, which is a neighboring country and has a very similar cultural traditions, has a very strong Christian presence nowadays. It's really in China only since the communists took power that the story has been so negative towards Christianity. So we shouldn't fall for communist historiography on this one.
And one of the ironies, one could call this a success or an abject failure of the Christian presence in China, but one of the ironies is I have on pretty good authority that the first works by Marx and Engels to be translated into Chinese were actually put out by an English missionary printing press, I believe, in Shanghai. In a literary sense, they seem to owe their existence to the Christian presence in China. But I agree with Eric. I very much appreciated his remarks, but I agree with Eric as someone who knows Chinese history and especially culture so much less thoroughly than he does. But I've read enough to begin to see, certainly, I mean, you kind of gestured very dismissively towards the Nestorian presence in China, but I mean, I think there's something very admirable and beautiful about the Church of the East's contribution.
I wouldn't deny that. Sorry, I should say, for the last 17 years, I've been living part-time in Taiwan, as John knows. I'm married to a Taiwanese. I'm very familiar with the history of the Kuomintang. I'm also extremely familiar with the attitude towards Christianity of the Chinese Communist Party, which is why I brought the subject up.
Well, actually, sorry, please.
Well, I guess all I would say is, I mean, I recently had a conversation about, yeah. So I understand your concerns, and Jullien is not making some of the moves I make. So this argument from Hegel to Marx to Chinese self-understanding, I take complete responsibility for that. So however promising or unpromising you find that, this is my contribution to my reading of Jullien's dialogue of cultures. But at the same time, I mean, I think there is historically, whether this matters to the CPC or not, I don't know, and probably not. But historically, I think there is actually a significant and intellectually rigorous argument to be made that to whatever extent the CPC state is Marxist-Leninist, they cannot understand themselves without exploring the Christian influence on Hegel. I find that at least an interesting argument to make.
Could I just say two things? One is, I'm not sure what the current situation is, but certainly 20 years ago, it was generally believed by religious sociologists that Christianity was making considerable gains in Asia in general. Obviously, it would differ from country to country, but what Eric said about Korea is true. Also, Vietnam, of course, which had large Catholic presence. But I think the second point is it might be useful to compare the way that the Catholic Church defended itself and resisted the communist efforts, particularly, for example, Poland, to persuade people to switch to the so to speak, social church, that didn't have much of an impact. Why? Well, partly because the Polish Church resisted strongly, and the Vatican resisted strongly. It had nothing to do. I mean, as the reader of a Catholic newspaper in England in the 50s and 60s, it was clear that the Catholic line on whether or not the church should come under state domination, there would be specifically, what do they call that church? I've now forgotten, but it was an attempt to have a Catholic church that was sympathetic to communism, and it didn't get anywhere because the Poles just wouldn't buy it. Now, the second, and that was the church's view overall. Now, in this, under the present Pope, the attitude towards China has been somewhat different. I mean, he lent on the local Catholics to do a deal with the Chinese Communist Party. That's one thing. In some respects, you see why the church makes these accommodations, because they want to protect the priests and the property and so on. That's fair. But obviously making religious concessions is I think, a mistake. And in the case of China, the local the bishop of, I think, Hong Kong and other places, some of the bishops wanted to stand firm, but they were, in a sense, undercut by the Vatican. And not only undercut in the sense that the negotiations were designed to give the Chinese Communist Party a veto over appointing bishops, but also, I mean, some of the present Vatican diplomats have made extraordinarily odd remarks about how China is the kind of ideal society that the church wants to have. I mean, I don't believe anything like that was said about communism in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And insofar as it was said, it was by small groups of Catholic intellectuals who had no backing from the church as a whole. So I do think that the church in this case, and I'm not talking about the church worldwide. I'm suggesting, however, in its relations with the Chinese government, the church has made too many concessions, and that's certainly what some of the bishops and cardinals think. I'm sorry. Now I've come to I think we have come to the end of this. I'd like to thank both David and Eric. I think it's been a very fruitful discussion. It's been very interesting. It's turned out, as we've been discussing it, to apply more and more clearly to more and more aspects of our relations with China and indeed with the rest of Asia. So on your behalf, I'd like to thank them very warmly indeed, and to particularly regret that we won't be having as much of David on these occasions in future. Thank you very much indeed.